We do need to move on, but I want to make sure everybody's clear about that. But the two forms of divided government, now hopefully we understand what is the most likely scenario where that gridlock can be, that logjam can be broken, so to speak, and you can have significant legislative achievements. All right, well, let's jump ahead. I want to talk next about the legislative process, and again, we're going to focus on what some of the fragmenting conditions are that or conditions are that lead to this fragmentation of power in Congress. We don't see it in any way more clearly than when we talk about this process of how a bill becomes law. Now, this flow chart here is pretty typical. It's the sort of thing that you see in textbooks. I think the textbook that we're using in this class has something sort of like this, where there's a flow chart showing how a bill becomes law. I want to go through this process with you, but with a little bit different twist. I want to identify the veto points. And again, in my effort to really drive home this point about power being spread out, under ordinary circumstances, power being spread out all over the place in Congress, and the frustrations that that leads to, I want to go through this process identifying what I refer to as veto points. Okay? Now, before we get to the details of that, let me just say a word or two here by way of setup. Okay? Everybody knows, I think, everybody probably knows, maybe I should say it that way, that the president has a formal veto power in the legislative process, right? Everybody remembers that probably from before they came into this course, okay? But if you didn't know that before you came into this course, you probably remember that from our discussion of the Constitution earlier in the semester and the checks and balances, right? Okay? So everybody knows the president, under the Constitution, by the Constitution, the president has a formal veto power. What fewer people seem to understand is that the president is, while the president may be the only actor in the legislative process that has a formal veto power, a constitutional veto power, the president is not the only actor in the legislative process that in effect has a veto power, that effectively has a veto power. And in fact, we're going to see that there are many actors in the legislative process that effectively have a veto power. Okay, so that's the point. That is the objective here of going through this process and identifying veto points. A veto point, if you like definitions, let me try to give you one here. A veto point is any point along the way in this legislative process that we're about to talk about, any point along the way where a bill can be effectively killed, okay? Where it can be effectively vetoed, not formally vetoed, effectively vetoed. That's an important distinction. Okay, so let's see how that happens. All right. Now we're going to begin on the House side. Any bill can be introduced into either chamber of Congress. Okay. And sometimes there are versions of the bill that are introduced into both chambers simultaneously. Okay. But for the sake of analysis, we have to deal with one side first and then the other side. I can't talk about what happens in the House and what happens in the Senate simultaneously. There's no way I'll ever be able to do that, is to get both of those things to come out of my mouth at one time. So we have to take one side at a time. By the way, the only exception to that, I just said that any bill can be introduced into either the House or the Senate. The only exception to that, who remembers from your reading in the textbook? There's a certain kind of bill that can only be introduced, that must, under the Constitution, there's one type of bill that has to begin in one chamber or the other. What type of bill am I talking about, and which chamber am I talking about? Does anybody remember from the reading material? I'm pretty confident the authors of the textbook make this point. Let me repeat the question. Think carefully about my question. Okay? There's one type of bill dealing with a certain kind of issue that must, under the Constitution, must originate in one of the two chambers. What type of measure am I talking about? What type of bill am I talking about, and which chamber am I talking about? Well, I tell you what, I'm going to give you the answer to that one, but I'm not going to give you the answer to the next one, okay? The answer to that is tax bills must begin in the House of Representatives. The Constitution requires that. If there is some bill that's introduced into Congress that deals with a tax measure, it has to begin in the House of Representatives, okay? Now, here's the next question I'm not going to give you the answer to. You're going to have to come up with the answer, okay? Why do you think the framers of the Constitution specified that tax bills must begin in the House of Representatives? What do you think their objective was?
Is it because the House of Representatives are more local than the Senate is?
You're certainly on the right track. You're absolutely on the right track, okay? Remember that the American Revolution was fought in large part because Americans of that era believed that no man's property can be taken from him without his consent. Remember the watchwords of the revolution? No taxation without representation. Okay? Everybody remembers that? Okay? So they fight their war of revolution. They secure their independence. A few years later, they write a constitution. They haven't forgotten all that, right? So when they write the Constitution, they are going to put the authority to begin raising taxes in the hands of the one institution that is elected by the people. Right? Remember that we talked about this point a little bit earlier in the semester, that under the original provisions of the Constitution, there was only one branch of government where ordinary voters elected its members. Okay? And that was the House of Representatives. The president wasn't going to be elected by ordinary voters. The president was going to be elected by this institution called the Electoral College. Right? And U.S. senators, under the original provisions of the Constitution, were not going to be elected by ordinary voters. If you remember, we said that senators originally were selected by state legislatures. It wasn't until 1913 that the Constitution was amended, well over 100 years later, that the Constitution was amended to give ordinary folks the ability to elect senators. Okay? So of those institutions of government, only the House of Representatives, only the members of the House of Representatives were elected by ordinary voters. So if you believe, as they did, that the authority to raise taxes should rest in the hands of the institution that is most closely connected to the people, then you're going to write a provision into the Constitution that requires that tax bills begin in the House of Representatives.